I'm not really qualified to answer what they believe about the rapture, but they don't have the sort of left behind stuff. I think that the rapture would be seen as like a far off event, not something that's going to happen this year.
There's no Kirk Cameron Orthodox movie out there. The proceeds of this monetized episode are going towards I Am Dying Out Loud. Find out more in the description. Sam, thank you so much for joining me on Growing Up Fundie. I really appreciate having you on an episode as a guest and just this opportunity to get to ask you questions about your background. You reached out to me on Instagram, I believe, was the first platform you reached out to me on. And I just thought your story was absolutely fascinating. And I would love to hear more from you about you. Enough from me. Tell us a little bit about your background and where you're coming from.
Yeah, well, Sydney, it's great to meet you. I've really been loving the show. It's my favorite new podcast I've come across in a long time. So.
Yay, that's awesome. I'm so glad.
Yeah, but it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I watched the Shiny Happy People documentary about the Duggar family and Bill Gothard. And there was a guy interviewed on there, Chad. I'm blanking on his last name.
Harris,
Chad Harris. So I thought I've got to look up more about him, and that led me to your interview with him. I just started devouring your podcasts.
That's awesome. Yeah, he's one of my favorite. He's one of my favorite guests I've ever had. He's one of my favorite people in general. He's fantastic. If anybody has planned on watching that documentary or has watched it, I highly recommend looking up all his stuff. He's fantastic. But you also come from a fundamentalist background as well. That's like why you were watching the documentary in the first place. Tell me a little bit about that. How did that get started? How did you get involved?
Yeah, and Bill Gothard was a constant presence in my house growing up.
That's wild.
My parents would read his books aimed at children. That would be the bedtime story most nights. And when I was a teenager, when I was old enough, they took me to the basic seminar, it's called, where several hundred people would gather and watch Bill Gothard on a screen lecture us for hours and hours. It was kind of like a college course.
Yeah.
Really.
That's wild.
Not based in any real knowledge, perhaps, but based in his interpretations of Bible verses and such.
Yeah, not accredited, just existed.
Yeah, and so I'd say Bill Gothard and James Dobson were two figures I really grew up with. My family when we were in the car, we would probably have James Dobson on the radio. Seemed like his shows were on all the time.
Yeah.
His magazine would come to our house, and I would read those because I was a big reader as a kid. My mom got me into reading at a young age, but Focus on the Family was one of the few magazines that came into the house. So there were some really traumatic and age inappropriate things that I read in that magazine as a kid.
Which is interesting. That you would think that would be the complete opposite of somebody who grew up in like the IBLP, like Bill Gothard world. You think the last thing that would happen is you finding stuff you shouldn't, and yet it still happened.
Yeah, they have both. There's the repression, but that is tied with the obsession with sex, and especially the more deviant or out there forms, there's an obsession with. And we see that today, this pedophilia craze going on, the QAnon stuff.
Yeah.
So this sort of creation of a false pandemic of that. So it's still going on, and that's some of what Focus on the Family exposed me to as a kid.
Yeah. And so was there any point during your childhood that you remember questioning any of it? Or were you pretty much like, oh yeah, it makes sense. They say I should do it, so I do it. I follow this. At any point, did you feel yourself questioning it?
I always had a lot of questions. I would say even as far back as I remember. And I find it interesting thinking about, because I was a true believer. I believed it all, but I also had a lot of doubts and questions. I think I figured if I just keep studying this enough, someday it will make sense. That I had to keep crunching it in my brain until it
And
all
then,
I remember
yeah.
I remember as a kid, probably 4 years old, thinking about the concept of heaven one day, and it had been explained to me that, oh, it's just, day after day you keep waking up and there's always another day, there's never an end. And a feeling of terror came over me when I contemplated that, day after day waking up, no end.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially
So
anybody who's seen the
yeah.
movie Groundhog Day knows that that's not always a good thing, just because you get to repeat it all the time. And so, do you remember like what any of those questions were that you had, or like does anything stick out in your mind where you're like, this was the one that I never felt got answered, or that I really felt stuck in my mind?
Yeah, either junior high or high school, I remember that, well, we believed in the inerrancy of the Bible. The Bible is the inerrant, inspired word of God dictated to human scribes. And I remember the pastor saying, how do we know that the Bible is true? Well, we know it's true because it says it's true. And he quoted a verse of, every word of scripture is good and for our benefit. And so I immediately knew there was something wrong with the logic there, that
Yeah.
we know it's true because it says it's true.
Yeah. Any
And
decent liar is going to tell you they're not lying. Like, that's the first thing they're going to say.
Plus that verse from Paul that he quoted was referencing the Old Testament, saying that every word of the Old Testament is true. And I believe there's also something of Jesus saying that no part of the law will pass away, not a dot or a tittle. And that was used to apply to the whole Bible. But of course, he's talking about the Mosaic law, which we ignored large parts of because we believe it had changed with Jesus. So
Right.
even in junior high or high school, I could see that and it didn't make sense to me.
And so then what was it about religion that it seems almost like you kind of doubled down on your faith by the time you were in high school and college? Would you say that's like an accurate description kind of the direction you went in?
Well, it was definitely a up and down ride. It wasn't a single direction. So I'll try to explain. In high school, I believed the more simplistic version of teachings, that I was giving a young earth creationism. I would read books about that.
Wow.
And I was really, trying to believe. I wanted to believe. So I would read and study this. But when I got to college, a lot of things started to fall apart pretty fast. I remember going and learning about the Epic of Gilgamesh that has a story of the flood written before the biblical story of the flood.
Yeah.
And learning about the Gnostic Gospels, that, there were these other Gospels written that didn't make it into the Old Testament that have a different take on things. And so with all these doubts, I decided, okay, I'm going to read the Bible straight through again. Oh, actually, I was reading the Gospels when I was in college, and I had done this before in younger years, but I really decided to make a study of reading through the Gospels. And I wrote down everything I had questions about. I remember one of the big ones is Jesus saying that some people in this crowd will still be alive when I return in the second coming. So that obviously didn't happen. And
That must have been very disappointing for those who lived out their lives and never saw it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So my doubts definitely increased. I would say I became agnostic in college, in terms of I knew I didn't know what I believed anymore, but I really wanted to stay Christian really badly. That my family, my friends, most of my surroundings were Christian, and I became influenced by some Catholic professors that introduced me to Catholic writers like G.K. Chesterton. And I saw that these were more intellectual writers than the Baptist and evangelical writers I was familiar with, which are really kind of a lightweight, fluffy sort of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, and getting into the ancient Christian writers outside of the Bible. So I started studying that stuff, and it eventually led me to join the Eastern Orthodox Church. which was kind of a strange detour given
Yeah.
where I came from. But
Yeah.
yeah, definitely a combination of believing, not believing, and wanting to believe all at the same time.
And what denomination would the Eastern Orthodox fall under? Would that be Catholicism or?
No, they split with the Catholics in the 1000s. I forget the exact year, like 1049 or something. Over a clause in the Apostles' Creed, the two churches excommunicated each other and went their separate ways.
So they're just their own, like Eastern Orthodox is just its own thing.
Yes, and it's actually a branch of the church. It's, although not as well known in America, it's big in Russia, Greece,
Yeah.
the Middle East. A lot of countries over there, the Orthodox would be the largest denomination.
And so
And
what was it about? Oh, I'm sorry.
So they believe that they have preserved the teachings of the early church.
Interesting.
Like they point to the early church fathers and say that we're exactly in line with them. There's been no change from the early centuries onward.
And is that true? Do you think they do a pretty good job, or is that just
Well,
a lie?
Well, I also think of like the Mennonites and some of the other groups who claim to be following the early church because they're very simple.
Yeah.
Where the Eastern Orthodox, their bishops will have crowns and golden robes and staffs and jeweled crosses.
Yeah.
So it's following the imperial version of Christianity, or once Christianity was approved and taken over by the empire, and then there's the Byzantine Empire. So they're following the Byzantine Empire's version of Christianity.
That's one thing that is just bananas to me about people who are so sure that the religion they follow is the right one, regardless of which one it is. Because even when you're like, we follow the ancient text to a T verbatim, there's still like 10 different ancient texts. So like even, you know what I mean? Like even that could have led you astray in a wrong direction. It's just wild to me that people are so sure that the American version of Baptist Christianity or whatever is like the way to go. And
when I saw the flaws in that, the American sort of Baptist version I grew up in, and later we were in an independent fundamentalist church, but the only authority there was our one pastor. He was right, and the Bible was infallible. That was
he was right, even though he was probably born after 1960. He was still correct about eternal salvation. Just wild. It's just bananas. And so what was it?
Sorry to keep cutting you off.
No, you're good. You're good.
But to explain my train of thought. So in college, the Bible as an infallible authority fell apart for me. Reading it, I saw, well, there's way too many problems here. It doesn't interpret itself. If you beginning on the first page, Genesis chapter 1, there's a certain order of God creating things. You turn to chapter 2 and it's a different order, completely different story.
Right. Yeah.
And so I thought that what we need is an authoritative tradition to make sense of this book and interpret it. And as I studied it, I came to believe that the Eastern Orthodox Church was the best authority.
And that makes sense, honestly. That makes sense why that would kind of track in your mind. And you would think, like, even the most basic editor at like any publisher would say, hey, I noticed that in chapter 1 you said this, but in chapter 2 you said that. And it just makes you wonder how these books get past so many thousands of hands. We're talking hundreds of years, and nobody questions that.
And even simple things. In one of the Gospels, Jesus says, if you're not against us, you're for us. In another, he says, if you're not for us, you're against us. The opposite meaning.
And so
an editor could have harmonized that.
Did the Eastern Orthodox Church give you what it was you were missing from your previous experiences? Or why was it that you felt more comfortable with that church, and how long were you there?
Yeah, one thing that appealed to me was the aesthetic beauty of it. There's incense, there's the priest in the robe,
Yeah.
there's a lot of artwork on the walls. But, it was not a long-term solution. I'd have a hard time even saying I was comfortable in it. It was very foreign because you have the bishops with their long white beards, kind of very grumpy, intimidating men. And it's a super patriarchal church and atmosphere, which at the time I didn't mind, but that came to bother me pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So the aesthetics were a big part because that was completely missing from my fundamentalist upbringing.
It totally. I feel like fundamentalist is actually like the more minimal, the better. I feel like with a lot of these American Christian religions, it's like, no, the minimalist is the way we want to go. Like you should not be focusing on those things. Whereas other religions are like, no, let's get all the decor, all the baubles and the gold gild. Interesting. And
Yeah,
at what
and growing up, I never had a spiritual experience. I would go to church and we hear sermons, sort of like lectures explaining the Bible, talking about the Greek and the Hebrew, and we would sing hymns. And I might have like a light, fluttery feeling at one of the more emotional hymns, but I never had a sense of God talking to me, never had any spiritual experience. And with the Orthodox Church, with all the incense and the artwork and such, it created a more spiritual mood. I still would say I didn't have a spiritual experience there, but it felt like it a little more. It was a more awe-inspiring environment.
Yeah. And what would you say is the difference between, for example, somebody who might be listening, wondering what's the difference between being in awe versus having a spiritual experience?
Well, I hope we can talk about this later, but I have more recently had spiritual experiences through psychedelic plant medicines. And that, there's no wondering, is something going on? Is something happening?
I'm telling you, praise be. If there was a shroom church, I would join it. I would join
Yeah.
it. But
So it's
okay, yeah.
like an opening of consciousness
Yeah.
and receiving messages from a higher wisdom.
Yeah.
That's what I would call a spiritual experience.
And so you, even through all this, you still ended up very heavily involved in the purity culture movement as a young adult. How did that happen? Because it sounds like you went from kind of almost IBLP or very much IBLP to maybe agnostic to Eastern Orthodox, and yet you came back to purity culture. Is that big in Eastern Orthodox, or was that a different journey that you were on at the time?
It is, I would say, especially there were a lot of Protestant converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. Those are mainly the people I was around. So if you went to a Greek church that's more based on the ethnic traditions, you wouldn't hear anything about purity culture. That movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that takes place within Greek Orthodoxy, and they have sex before they're married, and it's not a big deal. But in a convert Orthodox church or a more strict one, same purity culture as in evangelicalism, same belief.
That's so interesting that like somebody who's converting from a religion to another one still wants to bring that aspect of their religion with them. You'd think that they would want to leave that behind as soon as they could.
It was something I didn't question for many years. I don't know why, if it was just so steeped in me from a young age on. And then, in high school, the one thing I had been taught about masturbation was that it's a sin.
Right.
and
Yep.
And I was a late bloomer, so I didn't really have much. It wasn't something I thought about till the very end of my high school career. And then suddenly I have these urges and desires that I'm worried are going to send me to hell.
Straight to hell. Straight to hell.
And
Bye. See ya. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. And so
yeah.
what made you want to get so involved in it? Or did it just kind of happen organically? Was it a decision, or did it just fall into your lap?
Well, I would say I lived by it without really being interested in it. Like when the youth group would play videos, from James Dobson about purity culture, or they gave us all a Josh McDowell book on waiting for marriage. I wasn't really interested in that material because I thought, well, of course, that's the way it is. That's what I'm going to do. I don't need to read about it and think about it. And there were also some more extreme versions I didn't agree with. Like, I hadn't dated any girls, but once I was dating, I certainly wanted to kiss them. And the more extreme versions of purity culture were against kissing before marriage. And it was in college. My friends and I went to Walmart, and there on a little book carousel in the front of the store was Josh Harris's I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And one of my friends said, "Oh, have you heard about this book? Like, all the girls are reading this and getting into this, and it talks about, not kissing before marriage." And I took a look at the book and said, "Oh, this guy just wants all the girls to himself. That's why he's writing this." And I had zero interest in reading that book.
Which is ironic considering part of your story. Are we at that part yet, or was there more
Sure,
that
yeah.
you? Yeah. So then, how did you end up writing the foreword for his book? Like, how did you end up? Did you meet? Did you how did you become an authority in that space to the point where you would be writing the foreword for his book?
So it was through my ex-wife. So at the time I was getting interested in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, but before I had joined, this is 1 year after college, I read an article in Focus on the Families magazine that was aimed at college students. And it was by a girl talking about why she wasn't going to kiss before getting married. And I wrote a letter to the editor saying, I agree with a lot of this, but I just think it's a little too far, and that it's not such a big deal to kiss before getting married. And then the editor, I should say, I also had written an article for this magazine, so I had a connection with the editor. So she sent my email directly to that author, and the young woman who wrote that piece then wrote me back. We tried to find some common ground and struck up a correspondence. And then she said, "Hey, my family's coming to visit Chicago. How about we meet?" So we ended up meeting and ended up getting married a year later.
Wait, first of all, what part of Chicago? Wait, that's shocking. You were in Chicago? That's cool.
Yeah, I worked for a Christian magazine. It was called Touchstone for several years right after college, and it was based in Chicago. Not right downtown, but
Oh, that's cool. I spent 15 years in Chicago. So then
oh, wow.
did you did you think it was a red flag that you met your wife by arguing with her about fundamental beliefs? I'm just curious. And did you guys end up kissing before marriage? That was my next question.
So I think I argued with a lot of people at that time, so it didn't seem strange. I was not angry, but I was real interested in intellectual debate at that time. So I would just pick arguments with people and enjoy that. It's something that I've completely lost interest in.
Yes.
Now I don't think people change their mind through argument.
Nope.
But at that time, it was, I think, coming out of college, that was very much the college environment where my friends and I, having friendly arguments about these things.
Oh, yeah.
So that did not seem strange. And did we kiss before getting married? What we came to over time, the funny thing, when you make these commitments, you don't realize how hard it is at the time. when you've never even dated anyone before.
Right. Yeah.
It sounds easy, and then you get together and our bodies have their own wisdom and their own ideas. They know what they want to do. And so what we ended up doing, kind of fudging on it, was we did not kiss on the lips.
Okay.
But we kissed other, parts of the face and such. So, and we actually felt a tremendous amount of guilt over that because everyone thought that we, had zero kissing.
That's wild. In hindsight, is that just crazy to you that you're
we
felt bad about that? Yeah. That's it's I want to laugh only because of the background story, but then I get really sad when I think about how like people feeling bad about that, about just being regular, normal human beings. Like, first of
Yeah.
all, kudos for just kissing on the face. Like that's like I don't feel like people who grow up in those backgrounds give themselves enough credit for the immense self like what's the word I'm looking for the immense um there's like I can't think of the word where you basically for being able to stand so solid in their beliefs and their boundaries that
Mhm.
they're focused so much on what they did, like kissing on the face, they don't give themselves enough credit for what they didn't do, which is literally everything else. And so that's sad. And so did she
It directs our attention and our sense of morality to really stupid things.
It does. It
You
does.
know,
And it's sad
it's
because at the time it doesn't seem stupid to you. It seems very
right,
important. It seems like a life or death or damnation type situation. Um,
right.
but
When you
then
think
years
of all
later,
the when you think of all the Christian teachings about helping the poor and such, and then to think that you're just obsessed the whole time with, oh my gosh, I can't kiss her lips.
yep,
And that takes up all, and that's your whole sense of morality is not having sex. So
yeah,
it's a real distortion. And you were saying it causes people to condemn themselves for normal human desires,
normal,
just like believing I was going to go to hell if I kept masturbating without repenting and praying for forgiveness every time.
which is totally wild. And I remember at like an age thinking that made perfect sense. Like
Mhm.
thinking like, oh yeah, of course you're not supposed to do that. But now as an adult, I'm like, I would so much rather teens be doing that than out, doing literally anything else, like bothering other people or being hoodlums or just not, I don't know. Like it's so sad. I've never met a person who experienced that and like wasn't also just a really great person. And it's so sad to know these
Mhm.
great people who went through those periods of time where they felt so guilty about biology. They felt so
Yeah.
guilty about just being a human being. Um, and
And
then there's
it's kind of a lifelong process. I mean,
it is.
still working on it.
It is. Yeah, it really is. And and then there's the idea that, okay, so maybe people don't kiss or have sex before marriage. So instead they're just getting married at 19 and instead of having
Mhm.
healthy knowledge of how the human body works, we just have a lot of people who are very unhappy in their marriage, but they don't know any different because they got married when they
Mhm.
were 19 because they wanted to bang that bad. Like that's just they
Right.
just really wanted to, um
Yeah.
interesting. And
And
so
yeah, I got married super young as well. Uh, so getting back to the Josh Harris connection, I think my ex-wife had corresponded with him a little by email, sort of before he blew up and became famous. And then when she wrote that article that I read and responded to and met her through, Josh Harris also read that article and he quoted it in his second book. I think it was called Boy Meets Girl. So he had gotten in touch with her again, getting permission to quote that. And it's somehow we were traveling to Washington, D.C., where he was living. He and his wife were living near there at the time. So we got in touch with them and they invited us over and we met at their house. So that was how we got connected. And yeah, Josh, he was a very charismatic person. I was really struck by not only his written communication, he's a very good writer, but he's very much a people person.
interesting. And was that like a highlight of your career when you got to participate in that? Did you like tell everybody or was it something you kept on the down low?
So, well, that was meeting him, and then he put out a call for, and he put this on his website, so it's directed at anyone. He said he wanted to hear from boys or men who had read I Kissed Dating Goodbye, what had been the impact on their life, because he knew most of his readers were girls.
Right.
So he wanted to hear the male perspective, and so I decided to write up a short little essay explaining how I had, read this article about not kissing before marriage from someone who had been inspired by Josh Harris. And I also told the story of how the first time I saw the book, I said, this guy just wants all the girls for himself. So it was a little humorous essay ending with me getting married, and how, I was thankful to Josh Harris for making that happen. And that I actually, once I read his book, I found I basically agreed with it. So that was in there as well. And when he read this letter and then wrote me back, he said, hey, I want to use this as he said, I'm working on the second edition, the 5th anniversary edition of I Kissed Staying Goodbye, and I want to use this as the forward.
That's awesome for you, like at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was certainly my most widespread piece of writing at that time.
Interesting.
And
And
it's the
so,
version of the book with the brown cover. It has a brown sepia tone cover instead of the blue cover of the first edition. And actually, if you look it up on Amazon.com, the book has been unpublished. He had the publisher withdraw it completely a few years ago. But on the sample pages on Amazon, if you click on read the sample, you can still read my foreword.
That's cool. I mean, it's cool because of where your life has gone since then. Like, it's cool to reflect and be like, wow, this is like it's almost like a time capsule of where you've come from. And
but I will say, so only about within 4 years of that, I went through divorce. So my wife at the time, no longer married. And I remember thinking about that forward and being just mortified for Josh that, like, oh my goodness, his book is out there with this forward by a now divorced guy. And
did you ever tell him that you got divorced?
I did not stay in touch with him at that time. We just recently got back in touch a few years ago when he came out against the book. Then I wrote him, and we were able to meet in person. I told him, I felt so bad about getting divorced in this. And I think that the publisher actually then, when I think news of the divorce had gotten to the publisher, and they pulled it out of future printings and replaced it with the original forward that was done by Rebecca St. James, a Christian music artist.
Yes.
But so I felt horrible about it.
And then, so how old were you when that happened? When you like got married and when you were able to write that forward?
Around 25.
25. And so at what point did you start to really question this lifestyle? Did you really start to question whether or not it's real, whether or not they're telling you the truth, whether or not you still believe it? And did that have an impact on your marriage, or was that afterward? Was like the marriage over and then later you explored your faith or lack thereof?
So I was totally forgetting it until you asked that I took it to an even another level of being extreme, because at this time I was reading a lot of Catholic authors. I became real impressed with Pope John Paul II and his writings on marriage and sexuality. So, and then I shared these books with my now ex-wife, and she was excited about them as well. So we ended up getting into this anti-contraception movement.
Yes. Yeah.
So not even Josh Harris, not even the evangelical purity culture people necessarily go this far. Some do. There's the whole full quiver movement is mostly Protestant. And I didn't even realize at the time, I thought I was getting this all from Catholics. And I didn't even realize that, Bill Gothard basically taught full quiver and anti-contraception. So I had subconsciously soaked that up, even without realizing it, and thought I was coming to this on my own.
Yeah. And what did you think what was it that you were standing for in being anti-contraceptive? Was it that like I've always wondered, because with women, I kind of understand that angle, but I've always wondered men's angle on the anti-contraception movement.
That's a really good question. Because from this perspective today, I have no idea what was going through my head.
Yeah. And let me clarify, when I say I understand, I don't mean it makes sense. I get where they're coming from, I guess. But
I think it's because I had been taught that, sex has to be so sacred, and aesthetically, like condoms and contraception just seemed trashy to me. And again, it's because the way they were presented, in high school, it was, there should not be birth control in schools. Teenagers should not be given condoms. Such a bias against it that it took on an association in my mind that that's kind of trashy and sketchy. And, it's the people who just want to have recreational sex before marriage. They're the ones who use contraception. So,
interesting. Which, I mean, isn't wrong, but there's a lot more to it than that.
yeah. So I think my motivation at that time was just to be the holiest, to be the most right. And because as far as I could tell, or what the Catholics argued, was that the early Christian church opposed contraception. So I thought, oh, well, I believe the early Christian church is right about everything, being Orthodox, so they must have been right about that. And what I didn't know at the time, and with further study, I learned this, that really the early Christians were opposed to sex completely, but they would allow it if it was aimed at procreation. Like if it's aimed at producing children, we'll allow it. But of course, in the with Paul in the Bible, the very early Christians, they thought that Jesus was returning any day, so they didn't even want to reproduce. They just, and they were completely against sex. But it'll be allowed if you're going to burn otherwise, is what Paul says.
That's wild. And so, what was it that? Because it sounds like you were really, really like kind of deep. You were in deep, I guess, is the way to put it, really. And so, how does someone go from being that involved to no longer being involved? Because I know that, like, from my perspective, and I've heard a couple of people with this perspective, at the point where I started questioning my faith, I started hanging on to it for dear life. Like, I went from being, super cash back when I was actually like a Christian, to being the girl who like posted Bible verses and went to church every Sunday. Like, I was hyper into it because I was afraid of being sniffed out as questioning everything. Was that at all your experience, or was it something totally different?
Coming out of Christianity, interestingly, it was all kind of tied together with becoming disillusioned about these extreme teachings on sexuality in the early church, the Catholic Church, and so on. And it was a combination of study, because I was very interested in trying to defend this anti-contraception view. So eventually I started reading the early Christian writings themselves and started seeing a lot of problems there. This real anti-sex, anti-marriage bias that I had never heard of before.
Right.
Like I knew that they liked monks and thought monks were great, but I didn't realize how much married people were really second-class citizens in Christianity.
That's wild.
And
I'm so curious why they thought that. Like, how do you continue to have Christians if you don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, Jesus is coming back any day.
That's true.
So there was a book in particular. The author is Rita Uda Heinemann. She was a German theologian and wrote a book called Eunuchs for the Kingdom of Heaven. And if you look up this book, Eunuchs for the Kingdom of Heaven,
I'm gonna write that down.
It completely destroys the view of Christian and teachings on sexuality that we think of today. And she goes back through the Bible, the early Christian fathers and writers, and just showing this very deep anti-woman, anti-sex bias from the very start.
So she was more like exposing it. She wasn't supporting it. She was saying, wow, look at this madness.
Correct.
Interesting. And so after you were exposed to that, what were your thoughts after that? Were you kind of panicking, or did it make sense to you?
Yeah, I'd say, at first, definitely a panicking, because I had really put a lot of faith in this. And then the other piece is that our experience was not working out the way people had told us it would. Things were, for starters, so we were using the Catholic approved method, which is called natural family planning. The idea is you're supposed to abstain from sex for certain days and times in order to prevent pregnancy when you're not ready for it. But the fatal flaw in that method doesn't work during breastfeeding because cycle is all over the place. It's unpredictable, the woman's cycle. So
Oh,
therefore, so every time you have a baby and you're breastfeeding, which is the time you don't want to get pregnant, that's when you're trying to prevent it, you will get pregnant again if you're using this method, unless you're just not having sex.
yeah.
And I found that
Interesting.
the Catholic couples this was working for tended to be older people who I think just weren't having that much sex. So that's why they could successfully prevent pregnancy using natural family planning.
Yeah.
So
Or
it
if you
was
just like stay married to people you don't want to be married to, you're probably not going to end up having sex with them very often. Like you just
yeah. Yeah. So it was a
interesting.
combination of life experience, seeing the holes in these teachings, and then the more academic study of the early Christian writings. And I think for me, I thought, well, if Christianity has been completely wrong about this for the beginning, if there's this anti-woman, anti-sex bias that really goes back to the beginning, what else are they wrong on? And that's when I finally started reading books outside my bubble, whether it was Bart
Yeah.
Ehrman, different authors like that. And I started studying the world religions at that time.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
things
And
things really unraveled quickly from
I was
that
going to
point.
say, like, what happened after that? And so, first, I guess I should ask, I don't think I've asked you this. How do you identify now if you had to pick an identity? Are you spiritual, non religious, religious, not spiritual, agnostic, atheist? How do you view yourself?
Yeah, I would say the spiritual but not religious. And with
Got it.
my favorite label I would pick is transcendentalist. That's
Ooh, I like
Ralph
that one.
Waldo Ralph Waldo Emerson is my favorite philosopher. I really resonate with his teachings and beliefs.
Yeah.
So I would say I'm a transcendentalist of sorts.
So, then how does one go from kind of getting your world rocked a little bit by
Mm.
exposing yourself to new ideas and new authors and reading books that previously were kind of out of your realm to being who you are now, this like non-religious person. What was that like?
Yeah, reading about the world religions was a big part of it. And at this time of, people today call it deconstructing. This is back in 2006,
Yeah.
2007. So
Yeah.
for me, it was more of a deconversion. But at that time, so we also had marriage problems and, the faith changing beliefs, went along with the other stuff and just too much pressure. And we ended up divorcing. So that also kind of tied in with the changes that were going on in my life. But the study of the world's religions and especially getting into Joseph Campbell, the greatest scholar of mythology. So the main insight in when I first read him, I completely rejected it. It took time for this to sink in, but he says that everything in religious literature is a metaphor. And,
Mm.
it might seem to be talking about people, places, things in the outside world, in the historical world, but it's all really about things inside our minds, inside the psyche.
Interesting. Interesting. And I like that approach too, because I remember when I was a kid, one of the first real questions that I ever had, or one of the first real thoughts that I remember having were why Aesop's fables were just fables, but the Bible was supposed to be true. Because to me, it made perfect sense that there might be a story about a man getting swallowed by a whale that is supposed to teach me a lesson. And like it made sense that Adam and Eve would just be a story that was supposed to teach me a lesson. I never
Yeah.
understood why people took it so literally. And that was even when I really wanted to be my most devout self. To me, it just didn't make sense why we couldn't agree that even if we don't think the story really happened, we get the message, we get the idea. Um,
Yeah.
so it's interesting that somebody else would say that. Like it's a metaphor, it's not reality.
Right. And in the Orthodox Church, there's a mix of beliefs, but in general, it's accepted to read the Old Testament fairly allegorically.
Yeah.
So like Jonah and the whale wouldn't be taken as a historical occurrence by many Orthodox Christians. So that appealed to me because that was the stuff that in college I could no longer take it literally. So I thought,
Yeah.
oh, I mean, well, the Orthodox and the Catholics don't take all these, they don't, even Adam and Eve, they don't necessarily take that literally. But I had never applied that to the New Testament because the Catholics and Orthodox will say, well, the New Testament is completely literal and historical. And it was reading Joseph Campbell, I realized that, oh, Jesus is a symbol of the divine becoming incarnate in humanity, just like Buddha is a symbol
Yeah.
is a symbol of that. And we see all these religious figures through the ages sort of fitting this same mold.
Yeah. And does that mean that Eastern Orthodox believe in things like the rapture? Is that part of their doctrine as well?
I I don't remember thinking about that sort of thing much at the time I was Orthodox. I'm not really qualified to answer what
Yeah.
they believe about the
Yeah.
rapture, but they don't have the sort of left behind stuff. I think that the rapture would be seen as like a far off event,
Yeah.
not something that's going to happen this year.
There's no Kirk Cameron Orthodox movie out there where he's like, yeah, and that's also an interesting response because I feel like whenever I bring up the rapture, people either never thought about it and they're like, oh, it wasn't a thing, or they thought about it every day. There's
Mm.
no in between. They're either totally
Yeah.
traumatized by it or they're like, oh, I never actually thought about the rapture. Um,
Yeah,
and
I think I
so,
fell into not thinking about it much because every time people predicted it, it didn't happen. So I
yeah,
wasn't going to
yeah,
get all in a tizzy over it.
yeah, yeah. It's like as long as I'm included, I don't care when it happens. And so then so then did you just like stop going to church, or was there more of a moment when you stopped necessarily being religious, or was it gradual? How did your experience go after that, after you had kind of realized you wanted to view the stories of the Bible more allegorically than
Yeah.
literally?
Yeah. I
Because
I
is
started
IBLP is pretty literal, right? Like
Oh yeah,
IBLP, yeah, they're like
completely.
fundamentalists. Okay, just making sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So being a newly divorced single, I wanted to be around people, and church is one of the the few ways to find a group of people. So I actually kept going to I found an Episcopal church that
Ah,
was on the campus of Vanderbilt University because I thought, well, where do like the Vanderbilt people go to church? So I attended that, off and on or sporadically for 5 years or so, and just for the friendships mainly. I mean, the sermons were also often pretty good, definitely on the more liberal side, and the church did a lot of good things, and I was pretty involved in it.
yeah, yeah. I got no beef with Episcopalians, not that I know of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do remember the going on an Easter. I forget what year, maybe around 2012, and just thinking, I can't keep coming here. I can't keep doing this. Like when it's not Easter, the sermon would be something, innocuous and inspiring. But when it's Easter and they're talking about the literal resurrection of Jesus, I just felt like I can't keep coming here and repeating this stuff. So I
Yeah.
stopped going altogether.
And how did that feel? Was that relieving, or did you feel like let down by yourself?
It was nice to stay home on Sundays.
Isn't
Very
it though?
relaxing.
Isn't it though? Yeah. Um, and so do you feel like maybe back then you were somebody who was in search of leadership, where it was more about belonging someplace and less about discovering if you actually needed religion?
Hmm. Do you mean during this time of attending the Episcopal Church? Was I
Yeah,
looking for leadership?
because you went through so many types of churches and denominations, I was just wondering if maybe that's, like, something you later recognized about yourself, where you're like, "Oh, I really
Hmm.
felt like I needed leadership at the time of some sort," when it turns out maybe you're perfectly fine independently on your own.
Yeah, I think not with the Episcopal Church, but all my all my earlier things, I was definitely looking for an authority outside myself.
Yeah.
I think it was so instilled with me growing up that we can't trust our own conclusions. And, God doesn't talk to me. So of course I need to read the book where the guy tells what God said to him.
Yeah.
So that search for an outside authority, and which I believed was the Bible. Then when that fell apart, I thought, oh, it's the Orthodox Church. That's the correct outside authority. So then reading Joseph Campbell and such, I realized, and Ralph Waldo Emerson especially, is that we have to be our own authority. Our experience is really our main guide.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting that you get so much of your spiritual leadership from poets as opposed to religious text. I think it's very interesting. You're the first person I've ever heard have like multiple poets in the pipeline that kind of guide them through life but in a spiritual way, like that's very interesting. It's never occurred to me that meaningful poetry can have just as spiritual a guidance and leadership as, say, verses in the Bible.
Yeah, I think that's my artistic side. I'm definitely drawn to that. I love, painters, poets, all different kinds of writers, musicians. The artists have really always been my guides. That's what really speaks to my heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
Artistic.
Yeah, and I feel like music can really, really bring a spiritual experience depending on the music. I truly think so. Like I've never had a spiritual experience listening to Jay-Z. I'm just going to throw that out there. Never say never, but so far. But I do think there have been moments where I've been listening to beautiful classical music or music from, past times. And I definitely had more of like a spiritual impact on me than anything I ever heard in church.
Yeah. And even when I was a teenager or in college and really believing it, the praise and worship music really made me cringe most of the time.
Yes. Look, I didn't like Christian music even back when I was supposed to. It was lame. And so how have the people who were connected to you through that period of your life, through your religious period, through the IBLP, through the Eastern Orthodox, how have they responded to this new version of you as a non-religious person? Do they know? Do they care? Was it a huge impact?
Well, aside from family, it would be my college friends, I guess, who more have witnessed me over the years, and I keep in touch with them on Facebook or some. I have a couple friends here in Nashville. There's some that I visited last year. So people who knew me over the years, a few of those have also deconstructed or become more liberal. Others are still very evangelical, and they might have just watched me with amusement when I got into the anti-contraception and then got Eastern Orthodox, and they were more standard evangelical and not into any of that. So if we had a friendship not based on religion, then they're still friends of mine. It's still in my life. People who we connected only or mainly over the shared religious cause, those people fell away completely as soon as I changed my ideas.
Interesting. And was it like a silent one, or because I feel like people have one of two experiences. Either people just kind of fade away, or they make it known that they're not talking to you anymore because of something you said or posted or believe.
Mostly a falling away.
Yeah.
I think I can only think of one guy who I worked on projects with in the anti-contraception movement, who wrote me the very concerned, praying for your soul type letter. But other than that, just a falling away.
Yeah. And do you feel like that was the right decision for you? Do you have any regrets in terms of your journey or your deconversion journey?
Do you mean the end of the relationship with friends, or?
Yeah, and with the church, in like the friends in the church or the church itself. I wasn't sure if you've ever like second guessed and been like, I don't know, maybe this isn't the right decision for me, or if it felt natural as you were doing it.
Well, I try not to have any regrets over my past because it all made me who I am today.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. Yeah. No, I feel the same way. It's like, yeah, would I do things differently if I could go back?
yeah,
Only if I had the same brain. If I didn't have the same
right.
brain, then I need to experience those things to be who I am.
Yeah.
Psychedelics.
One thing that motivated me, so after coming out of all this, I still had all these Google results, like for articles I'd written for the Focus on the Family College website. And my main output, and mainly what I was known for on the internet, was this old purity culture and anti-contraception, that sort of thing. So that inspired me to create new things to bury the old.
Yeah,
So
that's great. That's like the perfect creative motivation. It's like I just
yeah,
don't want people to Google me and see this stuff.
right. And
As
at this point, none of the old stuff isn't prominent. You have to really dig into Google results to find it. It's all of my newer writings and some of the music or singing that I've done is what
yeah,
comes up first now.
that's great.
So I'm grateful to have the past buried, and I haven't even really talked about a lot of this with anyone before you right now. So
Well, I'm honored because I think it's
yeah.
fascinating. And also, I do think there is also value in being outspoken about the things that you have changed over time while those things still exist on the internet.
Mhm.
I've been doing stand up since I was 16 years old. Obviously, I do not tell the same kind of jokes that I told back then. Like I didn't even tell dirty jokes, but there's a lot of stuff that I tweeted or I posted or I laughed at that nowadays I'd be like, no, that is not, we do not laugh at that. We do not joke about that. And so
Yeah.
I try to get ahead of that all the time by being like, yeah, it was not a great idea. I've taken down what I can, but those relics are out there to kind of remind us like this is how far we've come. We've grown a lot as a person. And as long as you acknowledge it, it's not like I'm sitting here saying, no, what I did not, I never said that. I did not say that. And then people come up with screenshots. It's like, yeah, I said that. I posted it. I am a different person. I'm happy to change. And so I think that's like, that is the positive of that stuff still being out there is at least you have evidence of your evolution, and I say that ironically and ironically at the same time, to kind of becoming who you are now while that old version of you is still somewhere out there even though it's more difficult to find.
Yeah. That reminds me that so on Amazon, every author has a bibliography where a page where Amazon assembles all their books. And one time they automatically added one of my old embarrassing Christian books to my bibliography, and I wrote them and I said, "This is a different Sam Torode. That's a different Sam Torode. You need to remove that one from my bibliography."
That's
So
really smart. That's
because
I've never
yeah,
thought to do that.
because if I had just said, "Oh, I don't agree with this anymore," they would not have removed it. That was their policy.
That's funny. See, I can't say that's the wrong Sidney Davis Jr. Jr. You need to take it down. There's a different one. There's no plausible deniability there. Interesting. And so you had a shroom experience, and I want to hear about it.
Well, the main psychedelic ceremonies I've done are with ayahuasca, so
I've never tried
a
ayahuasca,
little
and I
different.
am so intrigued.
Yeah, I guess to how I got there. So first off, after leaving the church, and especially with the rise of Donald Trump, I became very more hostile, anti-religion,
Yeah.
anti-Christian,
Yeah.
because I thought that these fundamentalists were harmless. Basically, at the time I left, I thought, it's a small, harmless movement.
No.
And then to see them strike back through Trump, it was very depressing. Seeing
Yes.
people caught up in that. So I got more into arguing against that and defining myself against it, but also had a lot of depression, continuing depression from the divorce and other things, and just recovering from these Christian beliefs that we're talking
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
or the fundamentalist beliefs.
The recovery is no joke. For anybody who didn't grow up in it, they don't quite understand. It is a
Yeah.
recovery process, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. It's a whole thing.
Yeah. So I started watching documentaries about psychedelics and thinking, wow, this is, people talking about healing depression and other things with it. And I thought, this is what I need need to do. And it was at the start of 2018, I went to Costa Rica for my first ayahuasca retreat. And the first time it's an Amazonian brew. It's two plants mixed together. One is called a vine called ayahuasca, and it tastes like a very thick green licorice smoothie, basically.
Okay. That's so distinct, and yet I feel like I know exactly what that would taste like at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it can cause people to throw up, and it can induce visions and such. The first time I had it, I actually experienced nothing. I just threw up real intensely one time, and that was it.
And you didn't have a trip at all? It just made you puke?
No.
It was just like a Kardashian cleanse, just
Yeah.
coming out both ends.
Yeah. Then the second night
still?
Yeah. So the second night, this was a week-long retreat. The second night I drank it, and this time, things started to happen, like just feeling space open up, something's going on. And I immediately went back to a memory from 8th grade, like when when we had group showers in gym class, and it was just this real disturbing, horrible thing that I hated. And that was sort of the start of it, but it became this journey of receiving messages that I could trust my body. And it was like overcoming these events in my past about shaming my body and such, which is why I started with that group shower. But I began receiving all kinds of messages. Like I would ask a question and the answer would pop into my head without thinking.
Interesting.
There's the answer. So I felt, and I also experienced the white light, like what mystics talk about at times in their experience, like seeing the white light of the divine, the most intense light and just absolute bliss, a feeling.
So it was like a good feeling. It wasn't overwhelming. Interesting. And that's fascinating, because I got to tell you, I love shrooms, but I don't know that I could do it for a week. I don't know that I could do it. I don't know. So when you came out of that experience, what had you discovered about yourself, or what did you learn that whole time?
Yeah, well, that second night, that was my first real spiritual experience. I would say it was like, oh my goodness, this is what like the Pentecostals are talking about when they're speaking in tongues, they're doing these things. This is kind of what they're experiencing. But the main thing I came away with was that, there's this wisdom inside me that is wiser than me, like wiser than the conscious mind, or wiser than I am in ordinary consciousness. Like somewhere inside me, there is something that has the answers that I'm looking for. And I think the soul is the best word for that.
Yeah.
So I would say that I was talking with my own soul, or I met my soul.
Interesting.
So that was the main thing I came away with, and that's stuck with me ever since, is really a belief in that wisdom within, and that I can find the answers I'm looking for inside.
Interesting, because that's so interesting that you go through this period, the majority of your life, where you're looking for guidance, and then you figure out through this experience that the whole time you knew what you wanted, and you knew the answer to the questions that you had. You just weren't looking inward. You weren't paying attention to your own voice or your own kind of internal spirituality. Fascinating.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that voice gets so covered up by other things, all these other messages and voices from all the different authority figures in our lives. Yeah.
And just general doubt, because I feel like something that I hear a lot, including from like in my own experience from people who deconstructed from Christianity, is that they knew what they needed and they knew what they wanted, but because so much of Christianity is shaming you for your own thoughts and behaviors, and like you can't do it without God, you can't do it without the church, they ignore those thoughts and those feelings, because they think, if I think it's a good idea, that must mean it's a sin. If I think it sounds like the best thing for me, God knows better than I do what's for me, and that should be a sin.
That's one of the worst things. And people who are listening to this and hear you say that probably think that can't be real. Like they can't actually do that. But
Literally.
it's true. I remember people saying, oh, like in high school, I really want to do this when I grow up. But because I really want to do it, that probably means it's wrong. And God wants me to be a missionary, which is what I don't want to be.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
because I would hate being a missionary, that probably means God wants me to be a missionary. If people
Exactly.
would actually talk
Yes.
that way.
They would literally talk that way. And if your path has no struggle to it or no sacrifice to it, you're clearly not doing it for God. You're doing it for yourself. As opposed to, I don't know, maybe God wants you to have a good time. Maybe he wants you to enjoy yourself. Wild. And so how do you feel in your spiritual journey now? Do you feel like you are where you will remain to be? Do you feel like you're always learning? Are you like growing constantly? Like, how do you feel in terms of your soul and your spirit at this point in your life?
Well, I've learned you can never know what's ahead, what's
That
next
is
on
true.
your journey.
That is true shit. Yeah.
Like if you had gone back and told my anti-contraception self that, oh, you'll be completely opposed to this within a few years, I would have never guessed that. And then
You may have doubled
go back.
down harder on it.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm very grateful for where I am now and to have been able to go to these ceremonies and experience connecting with my soul. Like I was saying, it's not for everyone. It's a very intense experience, and not everyone has as positive experiences as I have had. But I think if it's right for you, you'll feel a calling, a pull in that direction.
If you had a message for anybody listening, maybe they grew up in an IBLP, maybe they didn't, maybe they are considering deconstructing, maybe they're not sure. What would you say to somebody who just really doesn't know where to go? They just have a lot of questions.
I would say, number one, don't worry so much. I used to feel like my brain was hot all the time. It was constantly spinning, crunching for the answers to make all these things in the Bible and such make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of that crazy stuff in the Israelites being told by God to massacre all of these villages. I would just think, okay, this has got to make sense. How does it? So, number one, just enjoy the relief when you give up trying to believe something. Like, just don't worry so much about what you believe.
Yeah.
It's you can just relax and say, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then getting in touch with that inner wisdom that we've just been talking about. And there are many different paths to it, whether it's meditation, people do breathing exercises called breath work. You can experience getting in touch with that when you're hiking in nature. So there are many ways, but so spend more time getting to know yourself and what you believe, what's inside of you, instead of focusing so much on these outside sources.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And this is mainly just because I'm nosy. Were you relieved when I Kissed Dating Goodbye was unpublished? Were you like,
oh yeah.
were you
yeah.
relieved? Were you like, oh, thankfully nobody is going to remember that chapter of my life?
Yeah. And I was very happy for Josh that he had changed his ideas and had the courage to pull the book, because that was probably his primary source of income.
Oh, totally.
Honestly.
Oh, for sure. And did you ever talk to him kind of about that experience, or because I remember you said you met up and you reconnected, but I wasn't sure if you guys like went into that at all.
He came to Nashville a couple of years ago. I think it was actually 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And a group of people met up with him then, and we got to talk for a long while. And, mainly just going over what we had been through. I didn't bring up, the income or anything like that.
How much money do you make? Are you going to be poor now that you don't have a book?
Yeah. But I was, very pleased that that he did that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that speaks volumes too when you've gone through a like a deconstruction, deconversion journey and you see other people going through a deconversion journey and you're like, good for you. Like, hell yeah. Like you do you, however you have to do that. I think it's wonderful. I think that's like the best kind of support is when you can support people through their deconstruction journey, whether you're close to it or not. Maybe you're just watching it happen on Facebook and you just vaguely know them. Maybe it's somebody like him who's like famous in a realm and you may not ever get a chance to talk to them, but just being happy for people as they kind of discover who they are and outside of religion and everything they've lived in. Um,
Yeah.
how would you recommend somebody recognize that they're getting involved in a like a cult or a cult like group like ABLP or any group that you consider to be cult like?
That's funny because even in the ayahuasca circles where we were just talking about psychedelic ceremonies, you certainly have cult-like groups
Totally.
there as well. So it's not
Mhm.
even limited to American Christianity.
Right.
It's tough because when people are getting into it, obviously they just don't see it.
Right.
I think with the Orthodox Church, I know there were a lot of things I didn't really like, but I just let pass, like confession. Like you're supposed to go to a priest, a few times a year, confess all your sins to that man. And that was something I never really liked, but it's like, okay, I'm going to ignore this red flag. And
Yeah.
even in that church, like the way the way I would feel when I would see images of the bishops with their big crowns and their gold robes and crosses. There was even a time where one of the bishops came to our church and the priest was being elevated to the level of an archpriest, and the congregation was supposed to buy him a jeweled cross, a cross with jewels in it. Instead, they bought him a plain metal cross. And the bishop was furious and just berated the congregation for it must be a jeweled cross. And the priest was embarrassed. But we just ignored that stuff, we just let it pass.
Did you end up getting him
So
his jeweled cross or did he just have to settle for the metal one?
I I don't think, I mean, he himself did not want the jeweled one even, so I don't think that was ever purchased. But at that time, yeah, I ignored a lot of red flags. I think that's something that people do when they're joining a cult like group.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I liked what you said earlier about how with like evangelicals, you're like, oh, they're harmless. They're
Yeah.
harmless. They're just out here doing. I think even if you're not involved in a cult like group, it's easy for them to get away with things because so many people look at them
Mm.
and say they're harmless. Like they're just here, they're just going to church, minding their own business. When in reality, they don't understand the insidious nature that a lot of these groups take where it's what they're doing that you don't see and how they're treating people and what they're telling people and teaching people that is the red flag, that is the
Right.
the cult like nature, because Hollywood has us convinced that cults are these big like famous fancy organizations or that they're something like the Manson crew where they're just these almost pop culture like people, when in reality it can literally be just the church down the street from your house or
Yeah.
the group that you're smoking ayahuasca with in the woods or
Right.
the fraternity that you join on campus. Like you just never know. um
Yeah. And even within a big church, like I was just noting how the Eastern Orthodox Church felt like a cult to me at times. There'll be cult like pockets, and then there will be other churches where it's not like that at all.
yeah,
But
totally.
maybe the key element is when the leaders are telling you to ignore your inner promptings, like you can't trust your reason, you can't trust your heart, you need to listen to us. That's perhaps the definition of a cult. Like
Yes.
that's the thing you have to run from.
When the people benefiting from you not trusting your gut are telling
Yeah.
you to not trust your gut, that's a red flag and you don't benefit from it in any way. Yeah.
Right.
Wild. Well,
And
Sam, this has been
people can feel good that way for a long time because, oh, the pressure's off. I don't have to think. I don't have to make my own decisions.
yes, yeah. I truly think one of the most harmful parts about organized religion, especially American Christianity, is that they put so much of the onus on you. Like, you have to behave a certain way, you have to dress a certain way, you have to pray a certain amount. If you're not doing it, then you aren't the one who's like not fostering that relationship with God. You. And once you're out, you almost don't trust yourself to do
Yeah.
anything properly. You're like, maybe they were right. Maybe I'm not supposed to be doing it. Maybe I need to seek guidance. And it's those people who oftentimes get involved in non religious cults or other religious cults because they've never existed in a world where they were allowed to make their own decisions and be their own people and trust their own gut. Um, and I feel like that's the hardest. You were saying it's like a lifelong recovery. I feel like that's the hardest part of the recovery is you're told for the first however many years of your life, you can't be trusted. You don't know what's best for you. You need to seek guidance. And now you're just like out here by yourself with nobody to give you guidance. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
how do you trust the next person you get guidance from? Like, how do you learn to trust them? How do you know they're good people? It's a scary thing,
But
deconstructing.
enjoy the ride, though.
Yeah, yeah. Hell yeah. Hell
Have
yeah. I've
fun.
had a great time. I've had a great time.
Yeah.
Well, Sam, this has been a really fantastic conversation. I realized I just looked and I realized I kept you way longer than I said I would.
Oh, I was going to tell you beforehand, let's just talk 4 hours and then cut out what you don't want, because I felt like
Or
there was so much to cover, but we covered a lot of ground. So that's great.
we did. And I really appreciate your time and your story and your insight. There's a lot of things about your story that I've always been curious about, and I really appreciate you just being honest and giving your opinion, and also your transparency. In that, you speak for yourself, but you never tend to speak for everyone as a whole, and I like that as well. I think that's a fantastic take. But if people wanted to find more of your work or more of anything that you wish them to find that's out there, you mentioned music, how would they do that? Where would they find you?
Yeah. My website, samtorode.com, has all the books I've either written or edited. And I'm an amateur singer. I love singing Frank Sinatra songs, and I've written some more country bluegrass songs with a friend of mine. So I have those on my website too. And then
That's cool.
I haven't done much visual artwork lately, but I have artwork that I did in years past on my website. So it's all there. You can also look up my books on Amazon.
Cool. And I will link all of that stuff in the show notes. Wherever you're listening or watching, it should be right there in the show notes in the description. So check it out. And Sam, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Sydney, you are the best. You're so good at asking these questions, and it just flows along. I really appreciate
I told Dave Warnock, it's just because I'm the nosiest person you're ever going to meet. That's all. That's where it comes from.